You're easy to remember because it wasn't so long ago that we talked.
Yeah. I'm back for more.
You're back for more.
I'm a junkie.
Oh boy.
Yeah, actually right after I got off my meeting with you last time, I'm like, I'm curious, just on the off chance there's a date open, and sure enough there was a date, so I gobbled it up.
You're a lucky man. There's some people going to hate you for that because some
sorry
people have been trying to get a slot for a while.
Hey, you got to check the calendar.
Yeah, it's a lot of people. I don't know if I'll ever do this, but a lot of people connect it with, if you support me at a certain level, then we can talk. And I'm glad I can do this because I don't want money to necessarily determine the hierarchy. So maybe persistence. So
yeah,
at least until I have a legitimate stalker, then maybe I'll have to end it.
Right. Yeah. Maybe I'll have to hold off for a little bit to give other people a shot.
Well, what's on your mind for today, Ryan?
So what is on my mind for today? So I have this particular idea I have that I want to run by you and anyone who's listening to see if people can poke holes in my reasoning here.
Ooh, a challenge.
Tell me why I'm wrong. Yeah.
Ooh.
Because it's a pretty lofty idea, so I'm sure I'm missing all sorts of nuance here. But
okay.
So I guess if I had to explain it a little bit, have you heard of the documentary that the BBC did called Century of Self?
No.
So I think one of your past guests, Josh, told me about it, or it was in one of his videos. But it kind of traces Sigmund Freud at the beginning of the 1900s and sort of the birth of consumerism and marketing and public relations as we now know it. Obviously now we understand how manipulative it is and how it pushes our buttons and all that stuff. So it's 4 hours long. It's really, really good. It's on YouTube, and it sort of diagnoses, I don't know if it hits the mark completely, but it sort of diagnoses our sort of cultural selfishness, I guess you could say, that I think most people would probably agree on is the reality today, that people seem to be fairly selfish as compared to other generations. And so it kind of links that with marketing campaigns, and obviously social media is more recently kind of a factor, right? It's a sort of inward view of yourself, and you see it with sort of worldviews. There's more of an inward focus now, less of a focus on family and community. That's sort of a starting presumption, right, for our idea. So let's just take that as true. Let's assume that that's true. I guess as I started exploring the political landscape, I became very interested in why the right and the left both lean so strongly on certain things, right? Like in general, the right is very much against abortion. On the left, you have something like environmentalism that's almost sacred and how important it is. And, you see it's like almost one of the doomsday like predictions, right? I mean, there's been people who have predicted the world will be done in 10 years. And so kind of where I lie on something like environmentalism is that it probably makes sense that we're doing something to the environment, but the question is how much, right? I wouldn't subscribe to the idea that the earth as we know it is going down the tubes in 10 or 20 years. Like that seems like a manipulative position to take. It just doesn't seem.
When you say a manipulative position, what do you mean by manipulative?
So when I say manipulative, I'm making an assumption that politicians will make more dramatic their claim in order to increase the urgency and therefore the support for it, which is a very utilitarian thing, right? It's like if all the best research, let's say, says that we're 150 years from some environmental catastrophe, which I think is plausible, it would make sense to me that politicians like Alexandria Cortez and stuff, like she was on, I don't know if this is out of context, but she was on the record saying the world's going to end in 10 years and we're thinking about how to pay for this, large scale thing. So when I hear that, I think like, well, that kind of sounds like you're apocalypse-izing the thing to get people scared and therefore to do what you want to do. Mm-hmm. Like, to me, that seems, yeah. So there's a lot of assumptions here that I'm making about intention, which is not super productive, but but
that's the part of your definition of manipulative. I assume what you mean by manipulative is that, let's say the person thinks to themselves, we're cooking the earth and it'll be a real problem in 100 years, but I'm going to go out and say 10 years in order to get action.
Right, exactly.
There's a deceit built into it. And instead of necessarily giving people good information, true information for them to use their agency as a let's say an image of God bearer, someone with the divine spark, as Peterson would say, someone who is a respected human agent, I'm going to take away that agency by willfully and deceptively and intentionally giving them incorrect information in order to use them to achieve a political outcome that I might think is good or desirable for whatever reason. So that would be your definition of manipulation.
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
So that's my operating definition, that it seems disingenuous or whatever. So yeah, I guess I'm starting to get a little too much into the details here. I lost sight of my original thing I was talking about, but I think that there's a natural incentive there built in, right? I think it's understandable. Politicians do what politicians do. They, they're gonna start slowly kind of being, like when you're telling a story of how big a fish you caught, it slowly starts getting bigger and bigger. I think that intuitively makes a lot of sense, that when there's an incentive there for you to get what done you want to get done, you build a catastrophe. And the right absolutely does this as well, but just to use this example. So that's, let's see, where I'm losing my train of thought here. I have some notes here so I don't go completely off the rails. So I'm trying to parse this all apart, because I'm saying, okay, there's probably like a good reason to be concerned for the environment. And again, the environment is actually just an example of what I wanted to talk about. It's not the sole focus, but basically there's a desire for me to understand how to get to the bottom of the stuff. So I think that, and we talked about worldview last time. So I'm trying to sort of understand the left and the right thing. Like there's things presumably that everybody cares about, right? Like enjoying the natural world and human value for life. But the left is obviously more interested in pro-choice and environmentalism, whereas the right is more interested in pro-life. And it seems like people on the right, I don't know why, maybe just to be contrarian, generally tend to not seem to care too much about the environment and kind of write it off, probably because of people like Al Gore, etc. So I'm just trying to get to the bottom of it. Like, why, assuming we both care about both of these things, it's almost like we have to take a contrarian position to be loyal to our moral camp. And I started thinking about the, that documentary, The Century of Self, and stuff we see going on with social media and sort of a general more inward focus. And this kind of gets into stuff you hear Jonathan Haidt, Vervaeke talking about, the meaning crisis, right? So it seems to follow that if there's a meaning crisis and a focus on self, then something that's going to come from that is apathy, right? Is just not caring, right? Which to me, again, this is all trying to make sense of this left-right split, and like what could be the reason for the fact that most people probably think human life and the environment are good things, yet we take such polar positions. Why could that be true? So I started thinking about the meaning crisis. And again, if we assume that that's a given, if we assume that that's true, that is the case, and that people don't have meaning in their lives. Let's see. This I'm trying to get too lofty here. I'm losing my train of thought. Let's see. Where was I going with this? So meaning crisis and apathy and I guess sort of the fact that what does abortion and environmentalism have in common is they're both abstracted, right? They're both things that, if you look at the recent stuff in Sri Lanka that happened, that's something that everybody can agree is a horrible thing that we should try to prevent, because it's very immediate, it's very obvious to our deepest intuitions. But things like the environment, things like unborn human life, those are both abstracted, right? We can't see them. So there's this trouble with how do you get people to care about something that's abstracted? And it seems like caring about abstracted bad things is a function of having meaning in your life and not being apathetic. Like, it seems to me that if you're someone who has sort of lost your bearing on having meaning in your life, you're the first thing that is going to drop off of your radar, right? The first thing that you're going to become apathetic about is things that are abstracted, things that aren't immediate to you and yourself, like future generations enjoying the planet, or an unborn baby that you haven't seen, or like, it seems to be that my hypothesis here, my highly tenuous hypothesis, is that the meaning crisis is linked to people not caring about. The meaning crisis might explain why, let's say, there's such heavy polarization that seems to be centered around, let's call them abstracted disasters, right? Things we can't see. 100 years the earth is gone, we're dead, what do we care? So I'm trying to piece together all these things. Like, we seem to be more inwardly focused, right? Century of Self, the documentary, social media. We seem to be about me, my life, not the community, not future generations. But you hear both sides sort of trying to appeal to outside of themselves, care about, with environmentalism, it's about future generations. It's about our children's children enjoying this wonderful planet. On the right side with abortion, it's human life is human life that has value. And it's so interesting that I think everybody cares and thinks there's fundamental value to all of these things. Yet my hunch is that there's something linked there with the meaning crisis and the focus on the self that is causing those things to become so untenable to people, that it becomes, your brain has to work much harder to care about things that aren't going to necessarily affect you in your life, right? It's like, to care about other people, we have to have our foundation solid, like our rock. We need to be good ourselves before we can then start going outward and caring about our friends, our family, and then it just goes outward into the world, our community, our nation, everybody, which is why the Christian message is fascinating to me, because it seems to be this tool for love your neighbor. And that's what attracts me to it, because I see political polarization, and I see like everybody sort of has a different worldview framework that are highly incompatible. So there's no real solution there. So anyways, I've talked long enough, stumbled around here, but I'd just be curious to hear your thoughts on, first off, if that made sense, like if you can trace the frame of thought I'm trying to get at here, and what you think of it.
Well, let's maybe start with the meaning crisis and think about part of what we're doing. Let's pay attention. Let's pay a little bit of attention to the exercise we're trying to do, and the where and what this exercise is situated in. For example, we're first of all, the left-right thing, you're thinking pretty much within, let's say, an American political sphere.
Right.
Okay?
Let's focus in America.
Okay, so in an American political sphere. So now already we have a context, and within that context, there are a number of things playing out. So it's an American context. So and we're trying to think in terms of, let's say, an abstract person, which is kind of funny because number one, there are no abstract people. There are only people. And so then we'll say, well, any person. Okay. So then I might even begin to ask some questions about this any person and say, does this person have shingles? You say, well, what do you mean, does this person have shingles? Well, because actually whether or not this person has shingles, that's going to impact their thoughts on the meaning crisis. Because actually, if they have shingles, they might not, shingles might do away with the meaning crisis for this person. And you might say, well, how on earth would shingles do away with the meaning crisis for this person? Well, because they're probably going to experience a high degree of meaning by seeking alleviation from the pain of having shingles. And so right away, even just introducing the question of whether or not the person has shingles, we've already noticed something about the meaning crisis, which is part of it tends to be, in the words of one of my colleagues who used this in a church meeting once, the fat man's disease. Well, what on earth do you mean by the fat man's disease? Who might say, does this person have gout? The fat man's disease basically means that this person is probably situated in a highly affluent country where there's a great degree of food security, physical security. You know, they have the kind of, for lack of a better term, animal security to sit and ponder things like the meaning of life.
Right.
So right away, you've actually got a pretty select subgrouping of every human being that has ever lived. And we would say not only a subgrouping of every human being that has ever lived, but probably even only a bracketed segment of that person's life, because they didn't have a meaning crisis when they were 6 months old and trying to find their hand so they could reliably get their thumb in their mouth. And they didn't have the meaning crisis when they're sitting in a nursing home waiting for some minimum wage worker to come and change their diaper. So, or sitting there with a very uncomfortable catheter because their bladder no longer works well. So right away, we're taking humanity and just shrinking it down into a segment. And we're taking two items such as abortion and environmental awareness. Now, part of what happens in the public sphere is that these two issues, there's a big difference between abortion as an issue and if you're a 21-year-old girl who grew up in church and has secretly been having sex with your boyfriend and just discovered that your bumbling at birth control didn't work so well and you're pregnant and you're going to lose status in your church if you have a baby or if you have an abortion. And now suddenly the question about abortion becomes not a theoretical question, not fundamentally a political question, but a very real question for that person in terms of their life. And what's now suddenly, it's not terribly theoretical, it's very existential and it's very immediate. And now suddenly a whole bunch of other issues that in fact might have been functionally existential and theoretical in the person's life, such as a moral position that believes that the baby growing inside this woman should be afforded the status of image of God versus the status they would lose if it's known that they're pregnant, or the status they would lose if it's known they've had an abortion. And so right away it's like, wow. So at that point, the whole political conversation about abortion now also takes on a different light. And you get over to environmental things, well, those are even more different because, and I would just throw out another question for you to think about as in the way that you framed the question. Let's say, for example, that let's imagine that AOC really honestly does believe that life as we know it in this world will end unless Congress takes dramatic action such as outlawing air travel in the United States. See, because here's a funny thing about environmental apocalypticism. People, and you see this all the time with people. People are very fun. People are very strange. I remember a friend of mine who was told that they had lung cancer and they had smoked all of their life. And, well, okay, doctor said, well, you've got lung cancer and we're going to try and fight your lung cancer, but you have to quit smoking. And, well, if we imagine that human beings are rational, we would imagine, well, that human being would quit smoking. Do you think that person quit smoking? In that case, they didn't. They just snuck them. And it's like, okay, so what's really going on with human beings? Because to assert that they're rational, that's never really worked for me, because I know human beings and I watch them and I watch me. And, you know, at the end of the night, if I'm sitting around and my wife and I are watching whatever we're watching on Netflix and Amazon, and we're spending an hour together enjoying each other's company, and I'm sitting there and I've had who knows how many calories I've had throughout the day. And if I have a thing of ice cream in that freezer, my mind is going to go to that thing of ice cream. And I think, you know, I really would like to lose another 10 pounds, but sitting right here with my wife enjoying this, the Amazing Mrs. Maisel or whatever we're watching on Amazon, I sure wouldn't mind sitting and enjoying that dish of ice cream. One little dish of ice cream, that really won't make a difference. And, you know, that's how we are.
Right.
And so, you know, okay, the meaning crisis. Well, the meaning crisis is a funny thing, because one of the great things that Peterson has, I think, blessed, one of the great truths that Peterson has blessed his following with is some pretty accurate articulation of the fact that we are mysteries to ourselves. Now, this idea, you can certainly attribute the psychoanalysts, Freud and Jung, we can attribute that idea to them, but this idea goes back to Augustine and St. Paul and even the Greeks before that. We are very strange creatures. And now, one of the things, just to throw in one other thing before you can take a stab at this, I remember back in the election between Al Gore and George W. Bush. Now, given what we're going to be facing in 2020 in terms of the Dems versus Trump and this whole thing that's coming, some people may look wistfully back to the days of Al Gore and George W. Bush. And I remember Ralph Nader, who of course was on the extreme left at that point, Ralph Nader making the observation about Al Gore and George W. Bush. You know, there's not really a lot of difference between them. And when Ralph Nader said that, I thought, yep, that's true. And so what Al Gore and George W. Bush decided to do is try to differentiate each other, differentiate themselves from the other side. And so, of course, Al Gore is going to come out and he's going to be, he's going to be for the environment. Gosh, he did a documentary about it, or he would do one in the future. George W. Bush is going to talk about abortion. And at some point you have to say, how serious are either of these sides really about these arguments that they're using? Because the truth is, if somehow the Republicans would make the whole question of abortion just simply go away, now we get into politics and manipulation. That's sort of a bad move, because abortion is a real vote getter for the Republicans and has been for a very long time. And now the Dems have some of their own social issues, such as gay rights or the environment, that they can use as social issues. And what's really nice about these issues for both parties is it doesn't cost them much. I mean,
Right.
you don't have to. For most of us to be against abortion doesn't cost us hardly anything at all. Now, for the girl who is a Christian girl and has been secretly sleeping with her boyfriend and discovers that she's pregnant, and in any case, letting anybody know that either she's pregnant or has had an abortion, she's going to lose status in her community. Well, she's got skin in the game. But for a lot of the people in politics, I don't see the Republicans doing a lot about abortion, and I don't see the Dems doing a lot about the environment, or even either side being able to do much, which is kind of the perfect formula for a political issue.
Right. And then neither things get addressed, really.
Exactly. Which is pretty much what we've seen for the last 20 years. And there are reasons for that. But now pay attention, when 9/11, these guys run airplanes into towers, how long did it take to ground airplanes in the United States? Like that. And that gets to your other point about, I don't think it's abstraction. It has much more to do, and Vervaeke talks about this, with relevance or salience, as he calls it. Because when those planes went into the towers, there was salience. And I remember one member of my congregation talking about her fear that Osama bin Laden was going to drive an airplane into her 3-bedroom tract home somewhere in suburban Sacramento. And inside, I had to be serious because I was a pastor, but inside I was laughing my head off. It's like, Osama bin Laden does not have you as his target.
Right.
Trust me. But we are funny creatures.
Both ways, right?
Yeah, that's right.
It's funny. My dad actually, because I was talking about this with my dad recently, he also pointed to 9/11 as this sort of example where people on both sides were unified at this very palpable evil, right? It's like, it's right there.
Threat. Remember, Peterson says, and he's dead on right with this, we see opportunities and threats. Abortion and environment, those are political opportunities. 9/11, threat. Whoop, yeah. Vote together in Congress with my people across the aisle, easy peasy.
Right. Yeah. That's a good, so it almost seems like, and this kind of gets back to my last discussion though, but it seems like you have to get to morality before, I mean, it doesn't seem like it. You do have to get to morality before you get to politics on an individual level, trying to understand, what do I want to believe? Because politics is an inherently, right. It's a game in a sense. It's like game theory. It's like there's people trying to figure out what other people are going to think. So they say things that they might not mean. So it's almost like this impossible playing field to come out with any real coherence, because it's somewhat arbitrary in a lot of ways. Right. So that kind of points me to morality. Right. And saying, okay, well, right and wrong seems to be the way, because evil is the lack of good, right? There's things that we can all clearly get together behind and agree that they're evil, but then it becomes much more complicated when we try to agree on what we all say is good, right? And the hierarchy, right, of have you heard of this book? Have you heard of Alistair McIntyre? He's a philosopher. Yeah, I haven't read it, but he has a book. I think it's Whose Justice, Which Rationality. And it just talks about the fact that people are coming at, right? So you have politics on the top, right, which is maybe our manifestation of our beliefs. And then presumably under politics, you ask, okay, how does X person arrive at the place where they say, I support this position on, let's say, environmentalism? Well, it seems like morality is what's the base layer there. And then if you dig deeper into morality, you get into teleology, right? Like, what are people for? What is, right? Morality is kind of like, what's the answer to the good life, right? What's a human for? What's what's a proper human look like? What does flourishing look like? We all want to flourish, right? But it's these different frameworks that we have that are incompatible with each other, where a materialist is never going to cede any ground on like I listened to an interesting conversation with Esther O'Reilly, one of your followers, and Think Club, who I know you talked with, about basically proving that there is a such thing as objective morality. And it just went in circles because the as you would
I
guess,
listened to that one too.
yeah, and it's
I thought Adam won.
yeah. I mean, I think that
I'd like to hear it, but Adam won.
I know. I think she got caught because he was basically demanding almost like physical evidence of, he says, oh, you say it's subjective, but where's your evidence? But I feel like the tool he was requesting didn't make sense I think objective morality is more not necessarily like concrete object, but more so like absolute or universal or transcendent. And I think objective kind of is confusing because objective, we think of physical objects, material, but that's not what it is. It's absolute. Is it universal?
Right.
And so he's demanding like physical evidence, like, where's your science experiment? And I'm like, what? Like that seems like a pretty basic, I don't know. Maybe it seemed like a really obvious thing, but I don't know. We all get caught in these things. But when I looked at that, I saw that Think Club, I guess his name is Adam, right?
Yep.
He was starting from a position of assuming no metaphysical reality being possible, and Esther was assuming
he's assuming skepticism with respect to metaphysics.
Right. Well, it almost seemed like he was assuming not just skepticism, but that it was an implausible, like it was ruled out from the beginning.
Right.
So when Esther tried to make a claim, I mean, I think she was getting at metaphysics, right? But his worldview from jump rules that out. So there was no way that he was going to acknowledge any argument that uses that tool, because he's not even able to use that tool in his worldview.
Right.
So anyways, long story short is I think that it's so interesting to wonder, and like, it's like, okay, you have these different frameworks that all these people hold. And it's like, let's say politics is the manifestation. And then underneath that, you have morality. And underneath morality, you have what does human flourishing look like? What's a proper human life? And then underneath that, you have all these frameworks. You have materialism, secular materialism. You have Islam, Christianity, various faiths. And then under all of those are assumptions that we can't and never will prove, right? So it's interesting because it's not like any one of the major worldviews is provable in an airtight sense, right? Like any worldview, and I think a lot of the new atheists would get a little skittish talking about this, but like secular materialism also rests on assumptions, right? You talk about the monarchical vision. It's like there's no view from a vacuum, right? Like we can't get out of the fact that there is no airtight proof for
can't achieve a view from a vacuum.
Right.
Paul can't, Ryan can't, Adam can't. And so in a sense, the move they try to make is exactly the move you started with. Well, let's assume an abstract person. Okay, why don't you show me one?
Right. But
you don't have one to produce for me. None exist, in fact. There's no such thing as an abstract person.
Right.
Especially if you're a materialist.
Right. Do you think, like back to your abortion example with the girl who got pregnant, do you think that person, right, not an abstracted person, but a real person who has skin in the game, do you think that they're in a better or worse position to make a judgment on the morality of their predicament? Do you think that you think that someone is more or less well suited to, because it seems like when you're in a sticky situation, you have very strong biases for self-preservation, socially, culturally. So therefore, like this seems to be where like in the Christian worldview, the Bible is so important because you need to almost have some external standard by which to measure something when in a given situation, you know that the biases are stacked up against you. And we know we trick ourselves all the time. So it's interesting to me. I think about the girl who has to go through an abortion and
the girl who's deciding about whether or not she's going to get an abortion.
Right. She's in that predicament. And then I wonder, and it's hard because obviously it makes good sense that like on a lot of issues that we should listen to the people in the position. And, I'm sure people get sick of, white men in the United States making all sorts of decisions about women's rights and, minority communities. And, it's a theme. And I get it that a lot of people are, you have this swing in the opposite direction where if you're not in this predicament, you can't have an opinion on it, which I think is silly. So it's very hard to parse apart everything. Right. And so that's what gave me,
let's go back to her a second, because here's a funny thing in our culture. So on one hand, we look at her and say, because she has skin in the game, should be the one to make the decision about it because she has skin in the game. And there's truth to that. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's some things that she has because of the predicament that she's in. Now, if she wasn't in a Christian environment and there was no loss of status for either having the child out of wedlock or having an abortion, the frame of reference would be different still. But we have this cultural liturgy that says only people with skin in the game should make decisions about their future. And there's something to be said for that. However, there's an opposite position, such as, let's say a judge has just been arrested for driving under the influence. Let's say that, okay, the judge has been arrested, they haven't been convicted, let's say they haven't been suspended, which probably would happen, and now they have a whole court docket full of DUI cases they are supposed to preside over. What would our legal system say with respect to that?
Right. No go.
Why not?
Yeah.
So here are the two issues. One says, well, unless you know it personally, unless you have the kind of knowledge that is personal knowledge, people without that personal knowledge have nothing to say to you. Well, I understand that argument and I see the point, but there's the other side of it that says the personal knowledge that we have biases us. And there's another kind of knowledge, this more impersonal knowledge, this knowledge that we're a little bit separated from emotionally, that says that side should have its say too. And so in some ways, a lot of the identity games that we're playing in our society right now, we're seeing one side of it and say, only religious girls who are pregnant out of wedlock should decide. Or they are exactly the wrong people to decide because, let's say, okay, only the people who are starving have any right to decide whether or not bread stealing should be legal.
Right.
Or should it be the baker who isn't going to eat any bread because he's been, elbow deep in dough and bread all day long? They should be the ones who are to decide over bread stealing. So, right away you begin to see none of these things are easy to deal with. And this is part of the reason why we approximate a monarchical vision via community and multiplying the voices. And that's why multiplying the voices is very important. And that's, in a sense, part of what's underneath democracy, where we say it's the hungry person tempted to steal bread and it's the baker who both have a say in whether or not we should have laws against bread stealing.
Good point. So it's just a synthesis of the two viewpoints.
Well, it's not even necessarily a synthesis. Both, in a sense, feed into what Charles Taylor calls the imaginary. Both feed into it, and then you have these legislators who have multiple things pulling at them. And in a sense, the way our system works is that there's an economy of forces at work. And so we hope that at least over long periods of time, the legislators will get things right. And this actually then gets back to, let's say, Jordan Peterson's idea about what the Bible is. What the Bible is the wisdom of many, 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 many generations encoded into stories that are enormously complex and sifted through and worked through, and that by virtue, again, he's coming from below, that by virtue of this process should be given precedence in the rest of our conversation, which I would say, in fact, it does. Because, and it's not just the Bible, it's history of common law, it's, all of this stuff that we decide, rather than in the moment where the hungry person is tempted to steal bread, you lift that person up and say, that is the only frame of reference that matters for the decision as to whether or not people should be allowed to steal bread. So, I mean, this stuff gets complicated.
It's so fascinating, though. I mean, and that's why it's important, I think, getting back to Alistair McIntyre in his book, it's like, well, I think we all like to believe that there's one say worldview or set that's true. And I think possible is true, but we're not going to know if it's absolutely true in any sort of definite sense as we define definite, right, in our culture, like scientifically definite. So the question is looking at all of our options, right? It's like a free buffet, and really we have to look at and understand what's the least worst, right? Like what, and that's what fascinates me about Christianity is like you look at, and I'm just beginning to understand it, so you know way more than me, but it's interesting that it has tools built into it that, like, what worldview has tools built into it that aren't just domineering, or like, it seems like when you look at some of the people on the left, the oppression Olympics, some people call them, it doesn't seem like there's any empathy built in so that if you get on the other side of what you're advocating for, you'll be a loving person. It seems like there's, and this isn't everybody, of course, but I mean, there's certain people that seem vindictive in their pursuit, and I look at that worldview, and while I don't necessarily disagree with what they're advocating for, I'm skeptical because I sense that even if they get what they want, this world doesn't seem like an awesome place because nobody's safe from the scalpel of their oppression ideology. I mean, I think a lot of it is valid, right? I think I agree with a lot of it, and that's the hard thing, because I do agree with a lot of it, but at the same time, I get this sense that there's almost this, you get into counterfeit gods. It's like when you don't have that, it's almost like there's a need to fill that with something. And if, let's say legislation on environmentalism is, very dramatic is passed, it seems like that would very quickly segue into something else. And like, I haven't seen the love, I haven't seen hints of a loving future. And I think this is valid for the right as well. So I forget what chapter of the Bible it is, but I read this verse that was talking about law and judgment, like you said, and it was talking about don't be partial to the rich or the poor, which is interesting. I think that's so relevant for today. It's because it's almost like the poor can be viewed as a tool or a trump card that people use and manipulate to achieve ends, and it's silly to assume that that's not also a problem, even though it's much easier to hate the rich person. Like, I've heard people talk about rich people, and it just scares me because they're like, this person deserves to die because they're a billionaire, Jeff Bezos. And I'm like, that's
they deserve to die because they've got lots of money. That's the idea?
Right. Or you see them just doing insensitive.
Tough crowd.
Right.
Especially if they're North American, because compared to, say, someone living in Pakistan or Bangladesh.
Yeah, right. So that just
you have a roof over your head. Do you drive a car? You drive a car, right. Baby. You're part of the top. You're part of the top 4% in the world.
Right, right. But that's the problem with relativizing and comparing, and there's no end to it, right? Like, it's not we're going to reach a point and say, great, we all have $40,000 a year. Let's love each other. Like, that's not going to that's not going to happen.
We're going to
So,
hate the person that has 45.
right, right. And that's what sets my alarms off, because I'm like, well, like, I think I know human nature well enough by way of knowing myself, that people in, like a communist society aren't going to be okay with people aren't just going to all of a sudden be okay with being completely equal in possessions and equal outcomes. And yeah, so that's why I think that like surveying the political landscape gives you good tools to sort of dig layers deeper, and then get back to fundamental worldview presuppositions, right? Leaps of faith, secular materialism, theism. And then at the end of the day, you're not going to logically prove any of them. So then it almost seems utilitarian. You just have to look at them and say, which one seems to have a system built in that is going to, that has tools built into it that will not just spiral on into forever. And Christianity seems to have a lot of that, although I'm sure non-Christians can cite, Leviticus. I was reading, and it's just like, they eat bread, stone them, and they all stone them. And I'm like, damn, okay, well, I had this very fluffy understanding of Christianity, and I'm going through this, and it's like, okay, well, all right.
Leviticus is a really cool book, but it's a really hard book. A number of years ago, when I decided I was going to start preaching in Genesis and just keep going through the Bible, Leviticus is a fascinating book. And even Rob Bell, when Rob Bell went to start preaching at Mars Hill in Grand Rapids, Michigan, Rob Bell, his introductory sermon series at his new church plant was on Leviticus. And actually, if you want to, you can find my bunch of blog posts from my Leviticus sermons on my blog. I have this section on my blog, which is sermons and studies. And before I did videos, I would often, just as part of sermon prep, I would often write a little blog post about the sermon that I was working on, just to kind of be able to vomit some thoughts out there and put them out. Leviticus is a fascinating book. But again, Leviticus, especially for Christians, and it is for Jews too, because you have the Torah, and then you have all of the record of the long conversations that rabbis and the communities have used in order to figure out how to apply the Torah in radically different cultural and historical contexts. Now, Christianity, of course, you've got the Old Testament and the New Testament, and there's a lot that goes into Christian traditions that developed long past the Bible, by which the communities figure out how to deal with that. And in fact, the controversy that's recorded in Acts 15, where the Apostle Paul and Barnabas, the new churches are starting amongst the Gentiles, they have this question about circumcision and dietary laws. And it's all these identity conversations about what ought new Christians to do. And they have the Council of Jerusalem. So, even having the book of Leviticus, even for highly literalistic, the Bible says it, that's it, I believe it, I do it. There's still myriads of complex, usually subtle, often under the surface decisions that are being made between, this is what Leviticus says, this is how I live my life. So but most of the time, we don't make these things up. So what we actually do is, we do what people around us who we admire, we do what they do, because that gives us, and usually as kids, we grow up, we do what our parents do because we saw them. And that's kind of your rough draft. And then you go from there. And as we talked about in our last conversation, you're at the point in your life now, you've learned from your parents, you've seen the rough draft, you're at a point now where you say, well, I'm going to apply pen to paper. What am I going to write? And you actually write, back to the big fork at the beginning of this book, which is the world a space of objects or a forum for action? Because after you and I hang up, we're going to use this telephone metaphor for a very non-telephone thing we're doing right now. Mm-hmm. After you and I hang up, another moment will come and you're going to have to do something next. And this whole world of decisions all floods into that moment, and you will make a decision. And will you turn on the TV and just use up those electrons that were produced by that coal-fired power plant, which is putting mercury into the air and carbon into the, it just whoosh. The world is incredibly complex. Every little thing we do, it's like the butterfly effect, out it goes into the world. So, and there we are, thinking nothing of it. No, I'm just going to go into the fridge and get a beer. I open the fridge door. How much electricity do I use now that all of that cooled air is just, flown out of my fridge? The world's an incredibly complex place.
This is why people don't spend time thinking about it.
That's right.
Right. You have to love it. It's a hobby.
Hard.
You have to be a weird person that enjoys, is a masochist philosophically.
True. That's true. So a couple more minutes left. Anything you want to get in before we hang up?
Yeah. We've hit most of it, and I know this is, obviously we can't get into too much depth because of the propositions I'm laying out. It's like the nature of politics and worldview. Something I wanted to quickly hit on is the idea of how powerful it is to change people's hearts and make them come to something rather than coercing them. Like, I see government mandated things where people have to do something good, and how people are much more likely to be reluctant to approach something. But you see it from the top down, like even with relationships, like when you're not forcing someone to do something and you're acting lovingly and inviting them in and leading them through example, I'm just amazed at how much more powerful that is. It's like you almost have to give people 90% and let them get the last 10% on their own. Yeah. And I think about that on a worldwide scale, and I think of like changing the world, and it doesn't seem like it can be something that's just legislated, from the top down. It has to come from individuals acting on individuals. And I work in filmmaking, so we know well that the one person is going to speak way louder than the 500,000, right? You see it, 500,000 children starving in Africa, but the one that you include in your film, that you learn her story, is such a longer lever for change and for empathy for people. And I think it's really encouraging to look at the Bible, whether or not I believe it or not at the moment, but to see that exemplified through Jesus, and to see that tool being used on people, and it's saying, you can come if you want, I'll be over here, but check this out. That's such a, like, I know that that's true. Like, I know that that's a better method and a truer method. And so yeah, that's basically what I would throw out as like a tentative, in response to all the political stuff and gridlock and worldviews. And it seems like you just have to win people's hearts in a very non-coercive way. That's the only
that's a very Presbyterian Church in America formula of how people work, is you win people's hearts. And you can listen to Tim Keller talk about that for hours on YouTube.
Yeah.
But the one point that, I'd like to kind of follow up on is, when everyone talks about Jordan Peterson and those who have influenced him, they obviously talk about Jung, they talk about Nietzsche. The person who doesn't get anywhere near enough footnotes when you talk about Jordan Peterson's formation is Piaget. Because the longer I listen to Peterson, the more I see him continue to sharpen and refine his offering to the world. Piaget is really at the heart and of a lot of what he does, included the equilibrated state, which is Jordan Peterson's is his vision for the kingdom of God. But also Piaget makes the point that the voluntary the society in which people voluntarily do good rather than coerced good will outperform the society where everything is coerced. For example, China. I heard someplace recently that China spends 4 times as much money on internal security as it does on external defense. Well, there's an example. The carrying cost of maintaining, of eliminating dissent will, in effect, that carrying cost will, over long periods of time, make your society non-competitive compared to free societies where you have freedom of expression, freedom of religion, where you value people within rules. We're not going to allow you to kill each other, but to talk against each other, that's okay. So, and the point that you just made is very much that point from Piaget, where the power of a person voluntarily, and this again is part of Peterson's gospel, when the individual voluntarily turns and addresses the threat, there's power there. And Peterson is right in that. So we're out of time. Yeah. So I don't want to short the next person up.
Oh yeah. I'm already hogging the airwaves with your talks, but yeah, thank you again. I've never had an hour pass by so quickly. It's like a time machine.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah. And I'll send this to you, Ryan, and whatever you want to do with it.
All right, that sounds great.
All right, take care.
Cool. Thanks, Paul.
Yep. Bye-bye.